There is a cut of beef sitting in the meat case right now that most shoppers walk past without a second look. It is lean, it is inexpensive, and if you cook it the way most people do, it can turn into one of the driest pieces of beef you have ever put on a plate. But handled correctly, that same cut can become tender enough for sandwiches, dinners, and even a steakhouse-style meal without paying steakhouse prices. The cut I am talking about is top round. And there is one part of the process that matters more than the seasoning, more than the marinade, and more than the sauce you put on it afterward. It is what you do before the heat ever touches the meat. I learned that lesson the hard way years ago. I watched people spend good money on premium beef, then cook it badly. At the same time, I watched other people take inexpensive cuts and make something remarkably good simply because they understood what was happening inside the muscle. That is the difference. Cheap beef does not always need more ingredients. Sometimes it needs better handling. Top round comes from the hind leg, which means the animal used those muscles constantly. That gives the meat a tight structure and very little internal fat, and that creates the first rule. You cannot treat lean round like a fatty ribeye. A ribeye gives you some forgiveness. The fat melts, the meat stays juicy, and even an imperfect cook can still end up with something enjoyable. Top round is different. Push it too far, and the moisture disappears quickly. Keep cooking because you think tough meat needs more time, and you can make the problem worse instead of better. That is why I do not start with a complicated marinade. I start with salt. Not a handful, not a guess. For a 3-pound roast, use roughly 3 teaspoons of coarse salt. Spread evenly over every surface. Then put the roast on a rack over a tray and leave it uncovered in the refrigerator for about 24 hours. If you have the time, 48 hours can give you an even better result. Here is what is happening. The salt first draws moisture toward the surface. That moisture dissolves the salt, and over time the seasoned liquid works its way back into the meat. You are not simply seasoning the outside, you are giving the seasoning time to move deeper into the roast. And there is another benefit people often overlook. The uncovered refrigerator air dries the exterior. That dry surface is exactly what you want when it is time to build a crust. Wet meat steams, dry meat browns. That sounds simple, but it changes the entire cooking process. Now comes the part where people usually make the mistake. They see a tough-looking roast and think, I need to cook this for hours. Not necessarily. Long cooking is excellent for cuts that contain a lot of connective tissue. Chuck, brisket, and certain shoulder cuts can reward you for patiently breaking down collagen. But lean round is not built the same way. There is not enough fat and connective tissue to give you the same payoff. So instead of trying to turn top round into pot roast, treat it more like a roast that needs careful temperature control. Set your oven around 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Place the roast inside and cook it gently until the center reaches about 125 to 130 degrees for a rare to medium rare result. Use a thermometer. This is one of those situations where guessing costs you more than the thermometer does. The temperature in the center tells you what the meat is actually doing. The clock does not. And do not wait until the roast looks completely finished on the outside. By then you may already be too late. Once the center reaches your target temperature, take it out, let it rest. Then heat a heavy skillet until it is extremely hot. Add a small amount of beef fat or another high heat cooking fat and sear the roast briefly on each side. You are not trying to cook the center during this step. You are building the outside. That distinction matters. The slow oven gives you control over the interior. The hot skillet gives you the crust. 2 different jobs, 2 different temperatures, and this is where an inexpensive roast can start looking like something far more expensive. But we are still not at the most important step, the knife. I have seen perfectly cooked beef ruined by one careless cut. Look closely at the surface of the roast. You will see long lines running through the muscle. That is the grain. Those lines represent bundles of muscle fibers. If you cut parallel to them, you leave long fibers for your teeth to break. If you cut across them, you shorten those fibers dramatically. Same animal, same roast, same cooking temperature, different knife direction, completely different eating experience. For this kind of roast, I want slices around a 1/4 inch thick or thinner. If you are making sandwiches, thinner is usually even better, and angle the knife slightly instead of chopping straight down. A longer, clean slice gives you a better texture and a more attractive piece of meat. This is one of the oldest lessons behind a butcher counter. Tenderness is not always something you cook into meat. Sometimes you cut it into the meat. That is why a deli sandwich can contain a lean cut that would be unpleasant as a thick steak. The slicer is doing part of the tenderizing. You can do the same thing at home with a sharp knife. Now you may be wondering about marinades. There is nothing wrong with using one, but do not expect a marinade to magically transform the entire interior of a thick roast. Acidic ingredients can affect the outer portion of meat, and certain fruit enzymes can break down proteins near the surface. But penetration is limited. That means you can end up with a very soft exterior and a center that has barely changed. And if you leave some enzymatic marinades on too long, the surface can become unpleasantly soft. That is not the same thing as making the whole roast tender. So if your goal is an evenly seasoned sliceable roast, I would rather spend a day salting it properly than hoping a bottle of marinade will do all the work overnight. There is another trick that becomes especially useful if you are making roast beef for sandwiches. Chill the cooked roast before slicing. I know that sounds backward. You just cooked it. Why put it back in the refrigerator? Because cold beef is easier to slice thinly. When the roast is warm, the knife can drag through the fibers and squeeze juices across the cutting board. Once chilled, the meat firms up. Your slices become cleaner. And if you have a good sharp knife, you can get them remarkably thin. That changes how the meat eats. A thin slice of properly cooked round can feel much more tender than a thick slice of the same roast. This is the part people miss when they compare cheap beef with expensive beef. They are often comparing completely different preparations. A thick, overcooked slice of top round is not a fair comparison with a carefully cooked, thinly sliced piece of premium beef. The cut matters, but preparation matters too. And there is one more thing I want you to watch for when you shop. Do not automatically buy the package that has already been sliced into steaks. Look for the whole roast. A whole roast gives you control. You can decide how thick the slices will be. You can season the entire surface. You can roast it as one piece. You can chill it afterward and use exactly what you need. You are buying the muscle instead of paying someone else to turn it into individual portions. That is often where the savings begin. And if you are standing at the meat counter and do not see the whole roast, ask. Sometimes the best value is not sitting in the display case, it is behind it. There is one final mistake I want you to avoid. Do not chase tenderness by simply increasing the cooking temperature. With lean beef, more heat does not automatically mean a better result. Once you push the internal temperature too high, moisture loss becomes a bigger problem. That is why I would rather cook gently, monitor the center, sear quickly, rest properly, and slice intelligently. You are controlling the entire process instead of trying to rescue the meat afterward. And that is really the lesson here. You do not have to turn a cheap cut into a different animal. You have to understand the animal you bought. Choose the whole roast, season it ahead of time, give it uncovered refrigerator time, cook it gently, use a thermometer, build the crust at the end, rest it, chill it if you want exceptionally thin slices. Then find the grain and cut across it. Those steps cost almost nothing, but they can completely change what inexpensive beef feels like on the plate. The next time you are standing in front of the meat case, look past the expensive steaks for a minute. Find the lean roast that nobody seems excited about. Pick it up. Look at the grain. Look at the price. Then imagine what happens when you bring that same piece of beef home and handle it like a butcher instead of simply throwing it into a hot oven. And if you try this, tell me what cut you used and what it costs where you live. Because prices vary from one store to another, but the basic lesson stays the same. The cheapest piece of beef in the case is not always the worst value. Sometimes it is simply the piece that requires you to know what you are doing. And once you understand that, the next question becomes even more interesting. Which other inexpensive cuts are being sold as ordinary roasts when they can actually become exceptional meals with the right preparation? There is another inexpensive cut worth understanding because it teaches the same lesson from a completely different direction. Sirloin tip. It looks respectable in the package. It is usually lean. It can be relatively affordable compared with premium steaks. And yet I have watched people buy it, slice it into thick pieces, cook those pieces until they are well done, and then wonder why the meat feels like they are chewing a piece of rope. The problem is not that the beef is useless. The problem is that the muscle has been asked to do something it was never good at. When you understand that, shopping gets easier. You stop asking which steak is the best. You start asking, what does this piece of muscle want me to do with it? That is a much better question. A lean muscle usually wants one of two things: careful cooking and thin slicing, or enough time and the right cooking environment to deal with whatever connective tissue it actually contains. Confusing those two categories is where a lot of cheap beef gets ruined. Take a roast that is meant to be sliced. You do not need to cook it until it falls apart. That sounds like a small distinction, but it changes everything. When meat is cooked for a long time, people sometimes assume tenderness will automatically increase. It does not work that way for every cut. The structure of the muscle matters. That is why I always tell people to learn the cut before they learn the recipe. A recipe can tell you what to do. The muscle tells you why. And once you know the why, you can adapt. Suppose you buy a lean round roast and want to serve it hot for dinner. Keep the seasoning simple. Salt, black pepper if you like it, maybe garlic. You do not need to bury the beef under 10 different flavors. The whole point of choosing a good roast is to taste the beef, season it ahead of time, let it sit uncovered in the refrigerator, then bring it out and let the surface dry while you prepare the oven. Cook gently, watch the internal temperature, and when you reach your target, get it out. Do not keep cooking just because the outside does not look like a steak yet. That crust comes later. A hard sear at the end gives you the browned exterior people associate with steakhouse cooking without forcing the lean interior to sit in high heat for half an hour. That is a much better trade. There is also a practical reason I like this method. You can make one roast do several jobs. The first night, serve thick slices with potatoes or vegetables. The next day, chill the leftovers. Now you have sandwich meat. Slice it thinner, add it to a roll with horseradish, mustard, onions, or whatever you normally like. The same roast has become two different meals. And you did not have to buy two different cuts of beef. That is the kind of value I am talking about. Not pretending a cheap roast is literally identical to a prime rib. It is not. The goal is to make the inexpensive cut perform at its best. That distinction matters. A lot of food advice online promises that one trick will make every cut taste like a luxury steak. Real cooking is not that simple. Butcher work is mostly real. Butcher work is knowing when to stop. That might be the most important skill of all. A lean roast does not need to be bullied into submission. It needs to be protected from the mistakes that dry it out. And there is another mistake I see constantly. People slice the roast while it is still piping hot because they are hungry. I understand that. But if your goal is the best possible texture, give the meat time. Resting allows the juices to redistribute instead of immediately running across the cutting board. Then, if the roast is going to become sandwich meat, refrigerate it. The following day, take out only what you need. Use the sharpest knife you have, and do not saw back and forth aggressively. Let the blade do the work. Start by finding the direction of the grain. If you cannot see it easily, make a small cut and examine the interior. Once you know which way the fibers run, turn the roast so your knife crosses them, then make thin slices. There is a reason professional roast beef is often sliced so thin. It is not just presentation. It changes the physical work your teeth have to do. Short fibers are easier to bite through than long ones. That is simple, practical meat science. and you can use it with almost any roast where the grain is obvious. Now let me give you another shopping habit. When you compare two packages of beef, do not look only at the sticker price. Look at what you are actually buying. A package of pre-cut steaks may appear convenient, but convenience can carry a premium. A whole roast gives you flexibility. You can roast it whole. You can portion it yourself. You can freeze part of it. You can slice leftovers for sandwiches. You can even use thinner pieces for wraps or cold beef salads. That flexibility is part of the value. And if the roast is larger than you need, divide it before cooking. Wrap the unused portion tightly and freeze it. Just label the package with the cut and date. 6 months from now, you will be glad you know exactly what is inside the freezer. There is no prize for making a simple meal complicated. One of the biggest lessons I learned working with meat is that technique usually beats clutter. People add another marinade, then another seasoning, then a sauce, then a complicated cooking method. Meanwhile, the real problem may have been that the meat was cooked 10 degrees too far or sliced in the wrong direction. Fix the basic problem first, then decide whether you actually need anything else. And if you want to experiment, change only one thing at a time. That is how you learn. If you change the salt, cooking temperature, marinade, resting time, and slicing thickness all at once, you will have no idea which change helped. But if you cook one roast with a simple dry brine and another with your usual method, then compare them side by side, you learn something useful. That is how I prefer to test meat, not with a dozen ingredients, with control. The roast tells you what happened, and sometimes the result will surprise you. You may discover that the expensive method you were convinced you needed was doing almost nothing, or you may discover that one small step you used to skip was actually the reason the meat tasted better. That is valuable knowledge, because once you understand it, you can use it again. And that is why I keep coming back to inexpensive cuts. They force you to pay attention. A premium steak can hide a mistake. A lean roast exposes it. If you learn to cook the lean roast properly, you become much better at cooking everything else. So the next time you see a cheap beef roast sitting in the case, do not think of it as the lesser piece of meat. Think of it as a piece of meat with a different set of rules. Find the grain, understand the muscle, salt ahead of time, keep the cooking controlled, use a thermometer, build the crust quickly, rest it, and slice it correctly. Those are not expensive techniques, they are butcher techniques. And once you learn them, the meat case looks different. You start seeing possibilities instead of price tags. You start noticing which muscles are naturally tender, which ones need slow cooking, which ones benefit from thin slicing, and which ones should never be treated like a ribeye. That knowledge can save you money for years. And there is one more category of beef where this becomes especially interesting. Some of the toughest looking cuts in the store are actually hiding enormous flavor because they contain exactly the kind of connective tissue that responds beautifully to slow cooking. But there is a catch. If you cook those cuts the same way you cook a lean round roast, you can get the opposite result. That is where the difference between lean muscle and collagen-rich muscle becomes impossible to ignore. And once you know how to identify that difference before you buy the meat, you can walk into almost any grocery store and know which inexpensive cuts are worth taking home. That distinction between lean muscle and collagen-rich muscle is something I wish more shoppers understood, because two pieces of beef can both look tough in the package and require completely different treatment. A lean round roast has very little internal fat and relatively little connective tissue. Its strength is in being roasted carefully and sliced thin. A chuck roast is another story. Chuck has more connective tissue woven through the muscle. That can make it chewy when it is undercooked, but it can also make it incredible when you give that collagen enough time to break down. This is where patience actually pays. If you take a chuck roast and cook it gently for several hours, the collagen gradually changes into gelatin. That gelatin gives the meat the rich, soft texture people are looking for. So when somebody tells you that a cheap cut needs to be cooked low and slow, the first question should be, which cheap cut? That one question can save you from ruining dinner. If you take the low and slow rule meant for chuck and apply it to a lean round, you can dry it out. If you take the quick roast approach meant for lean round and apply it to chuck, you can end up with beef that is still chewy. Same animal, different muscle, different job. That is why I never trust a cooking rule that ignores the cut. Now, here is a simple way to think about the meat case. If the muscle worked hard but has a lot of connective tissue, slow cooking may be your friend. If the muscle is lean and dense with little connective tissue, careful temperature control and thin slicing may be the better answer. You do not need to memorize every muscle in the animal. Just start paying attention to what you are buying. And there is another inexpensive cut that demonstrates this perfectly: beef shank. Nobody looks at a beef shank and thinks steakhouse. It is full of connective tissue and can be extremely tough if cooked quickly. But give it time and moisture, and that same collagen becomes the reason the finished dish tastes so rich. This is the part of butcher knowledge that does not show up on a price tag. The cheapest cut is not automatically the best deal. The best deal is the cut, whose natural characteristics match the meal you want to make. That is a much smarter way to shop. If you want roast beef for sandwiches, buy a lean roast and think about slicing. If you want a Sunday dinner that falls apart with a fork, look for a collagen-rich cut and plan on giving it time. If you want a steak that you can cook quickly in a skillet, choose a muscle that can handle that treatment. The mistake is trying to force one cooking method onto every piece of beef. I learned that behind the counter, customers would come in with a recipe they loved and ask which cut to buy. Sometimes the answer was not the cut they expected. Sometimes I would tell them to buy something cheaper because it matched the recipe better. That is the kind of advice that actually saves money, not finding the cheapest package, finding the cheapest package that can do the job. And there is one more habit worth developing. Before you buy an unfamiliar cut, look at its shape. A long, uniform roast with visible grain is going to behave differently from a heavily marbled steak. A thick, connective, tissue-rich piece with seams running through it tells you something too. You do not need to be an expert. Just start looking. The meat is giving you clues. And once you learn to read those clues, the grocery store becomes a different place. You stop being completely dependent on the recipe card. You can make decisions for yourself. That is the real advantage of learning butcher knowledge. It gives you options. You can walk into the store with a limited budget and still leave with something worth cooking. You can see a roast marked down and know whether it is actually a bargain. You can recognize when a thick steak is likely to disappoint, and you can understand why one cut belongs in a hot skillet while another belongs in a covered pot for hours. That knowledge is worth more than any single recipe. So if you are trying this with the lean roast we started with, remember the entire chain: season ahead, dry the surface, cook gently, watch the internal temperature, sear quickly, rest, chill if you want very thin slices, then cut across the grain. Do not skip the last step. People spend hours cooking a roast and then give the knife 10 seconds. That makes no sense. The knife is part of the cooking method. Use it like one. And if you want to see whether this really makes a difference, do a simple test at home. Take 2 pieces from the same roast, cook them the same way, cut one thick and across the grain, cut the other thin and across the grain, then compare them. You will notice immediately how much slicing changes the experience. If you have enough meat, take it one step